I'm joined now by George Simon, who's the Director, Software and Services at Itron. George, first of all, welcome. Thanks for making the time to be here. Must be quite nice to just sit down and not be on your feet.
Very nice.
So the theme that we're going to explore is taming the DER beast. All these distributed energy resources coming onto the grid. And just to kick us off, can you give us an overview of the problem and the real world impacts that you're seeing? Because you're in the thick of this space all the time.
Sure, thanks Adam. So there's really three real world pain problems for utilities with DERs. And the first really has to do with loss of revenue. So every PV system, if you just think about, one of the most predominant DERs is PV photovoltaics, is a loss of electricity sales to utilities, even if you're decoupled. And when you think about the magnitude of how quickly and how much PV is going into the grid, they say in the United States that every minute a PV system is being installed in the U.S. In addition, you just look at worldwide, it's tremendous, right? 300 gigawatts of PV installed worldwide, so it's not just unique to the United States. So it's a loss of revenue, potentially. When you begin to add in storage in combination with PV, Rocky Mountain Institute did a study where they talked about grid defection. Right, so as the cost of PV and storage decreases, ultimately utilities have to be concerned, are people going to leave the utility? That would leave them with stranded assets. So that's the first real world pain problem that utilities have. And I think most utilities understand that. Some tend to look at it as, well, it's not my problem, I don't have high penetration of PV. So that really turns us to the second real world problem. So as we begin to see more and more PV on the grid, what's happening is it's changing what we call the net load shape within the utility. You might think of historically, homes have seen increase in demand in the morning, followed by a lower demand in the afternoon, and then increased demand in the evening when people come home. When you get photovoltaics that are being installed at homes, all of a sudden you get a PV profile midday when demand is low, and it potentially can cause what's known as reverse power flow. You add into that electric vehicles, which can easily double the demand at the home. And what we're seeing now is an even steeper peak in the evening. So one of the things that the California Independent System Operator looked at was what they called a duck curve. So this very classic, the tail of the duck, belly in the midday, and the neck of the duck, very steep peak demand in the evening. Those cause problems to utilities in that these are net flows that impact how they operate the grid, and also what do they have to do for infrastructure costs. In addition, not all customers behave the same way. Some charge vehicles at different times, so they're seeing a variety of these different types of net loads. So that causes an uncertainty problem with them for the utilities.
And so we've got these three issues, and I am now the utility, and traditionally the distribution end has been fairly passive. It's now starting to get pretty interesting and active. How do we help, or how are utilities tackling solving that problem? Particularly around what's happening at the edge generation. Is this where this notion of actually let's try and deal with this as quickly as we can, as much as we possibly can at the edge, rather than bringing it back into the center of the distribution grid, where it causes an even bigger problem?
Yeah. That really is at the heart of what's going on right now with different utilities. So they're beginning to look at analytics. What can grid analytics and grid devices do, smart meters? And they're really looking at different pilots to entertain ways to resolve this. One of the pilots that Itron is involved in is in San Diego. We're actually part of a team deploying advanced analytics and grid edge devices in 100 homes in the San Diego territory. The intent is to try to take that duck curve that I talked about and flatten it. and not only flatten it within the homes, although again that's a primary goal, is how can we reduce those, flatten the curve in the evening and fill the belly of the duct in the midday by trying to blend and orchestrate loads within the home. So you can do pre-cooling, for example. You can charge the electric vehicle from the battery system. You can use the PV system to charge the battery. So at the heart of that, though, is distributed intelligence. So how do you figure out how best to do that? So you use advanced sensing, you use what we call local intelligent agents, so that you can actually control these and optimize them based on cost. So that's one way to do it. But at the same time, that gives you control within the house, but you also need control within the grid. Okay, and again, distributed intelligence has the capability to do what we call peer-to-peer communication. So if you have a meter that is located, we can call it a bellwether meter, for example, that's actually sensing what's going on in that particular area and what's happening in the grid at that time. It can communicate with other meters and say, oh, by the way, this is happening. You have this encroachment of either a heat event or some other type of event. And so peer-to-peer communication gets you to a point where you can begin to think about how you can distribute DERs. So that helps you quite a bit.
And is that where, and again, just so that I fully understand it, so you get potentially a situation where someone comes home and says, hey, I'm going to plug in my car now, I want to charge it, and the house next door happens to have PVs and a battery, and you go, well, rather than charging it way back from where something gets generated, let's charge it from the neighbor, right? Because there's capacity there. So is that, are you also within this pilot looking at that sort of transactive energy? That's the term that's coming
as the
in.
pilot builds out, we'll look at that. But right now, the primary focus of the pilot is really just to prove that with using distributed intelligence, we can actually control the loads and do price optimization, and that we get customers' response to price signals. So one of the interesting facets that utilities are looking at is what kind of control can they use inside the home? Do they have to do something pretty invasive, or can they get away with just price signals? So the utilities are beginning to look at that. They also, just as you pointed out, Adam, they really do want to understand, with peer-to-peer communication, how much can they close off some of the increased demand that they see from one of the houses by use of this type of intelligence, and do it all the way up to the substation. So as you think about the fact that feeders are loaded with different penetrations of different types of DERs, distributed intelligence gives you insight into what those DERs are like, what their performance is like, and how to begin to orchestrate within the grid.
Yeah, because not all PV systems are the same, right? So some have a higher quality and better voltage profiles and what have you. So I'm fascinated by this pilot, because it seems to me that you're trying to get 100 housing units to almost act as one. And what's amazing to me as well is, and I'd like your view on this, is, I've always argued that the only way you can do that is by having or getting that digital trust from the customer to be able to turn around and say, listen, we will be the energy manager of your home. Mm-hmm. Within the comfort profiles that you set, like I still want my aircon on, I still want my fridge to work and not defrost and things like that. But within that parameter, trust us and we will optimize. And by doing so, how do you motivate people to be willing and part of that ecosystem? Is it pricing? Is it?
It's a combination of things.
Right.
And fortunately, Itron just acquired Converge in June. Converge is one of the top demand response companies in the country, and with a lot of intelligence about how do you motivate people. They're now armed with this distributed intelligence. We work with customer preferences, so the last thing you want to do is over-control the customer. You want to give customers a feeling that they have choice. It's really important to customers. So whether it's I want my car to be charged 80% before I leave in the morning, or I want 120 miles of range, I don't want my air conditioner to go above 2 degrees. You're able to motivate them by what their preference is, the fact that they can make these choices, and money comes into account here. So they can end up with, in this particular case of the pilot, we're looking at least a 15 to 20% savings to the customers. I think it'll be higher than that, but that's our minimum goal. So there's a number of factors that I think motivate customers.
And how then the three problems that you mentioned, and I think we've got a sense of how you're going to go about flattening the duck curve in a way, but does this pilot or maybe other things you're doing also start talking to the utility sector in terms of that revenue loss piece? Because
Yes.
we're starting to, there were Avista was in your seat, and they were saying that we need to stay relevant. We need to start looking at different services that we offer, because the energy retail piece alone ain't going to keep us alive.
Right. And that's a real interesting fact. We've talked to utilities that are interested in how can they become the trusted custodian for their customers. When you start to think about the idea that PV and storage can end up with revenue loss, the utilities can actually do some jujitsu and turn that around. Now all of a sudden they can provide ways for customers to charge their cars in certain locations to give them better economies. They can offer them, they can be an objective body, technical expert to customers. You don't have to be wedded to one particular type of a vendor. The utilities can offer to monitor. With distributed intelligence, they can actually go through and say, okay, you don't really need storage, or this is the amount of storage you need. You don't have to over. So it provides the utilities with an entirely new line of service. In addition, if you think about where they want to locate charging, so as we see a growth in electric vehicles, this is going to be a very interesting situation for utilities to decide, where do I want to charge, where do I want people to charge? Is it going to be better for them to charge at home? Are there areas in my grid that can actually be beefed up? The grid's a very uneven topology. Some feeders are very over-constrained, some are less constrained. Things like, how do I want to grow the economies within my utility? How can I, in my service territory, how can I be a better partner to my customers?
So when I was talking to someone who runs a transmission operator in the Netherlands, that gentleman said to me that electromobility really is the elephant in the room.
Yes.
In terms of, you look at the announcement by Volvo in terms of 2018, all electric. Every single car manufacturer is on similar trajectories. In your words, how seismic is that? Because that is an outside industry coming in for the first time that ain't gonna be stopped. I know for a fact that companies like Porsche and Mercedes are hiring people from distribution grid networks, because they're going, hey, we might build this out ourselves, because we might be selling cars with energy, right?
Right.
Yeah.
So from a utility perspective, it's difficult to, right now the locational value is everything, right? Just like in real estate, location is everything. As I mentioned, some distribution feeders are more constrained or have different types of problems. Bottom line though is the utilities spend billions of dollars every year on distribution upgrades. And if through distributed intelligence, we're able to not only defer that, but in some cases actually eliminate those costs, it's a huge, huge opening. Again, somebody's going to take advantage of that.
I'm getting signals that we're coming to the end of our time, but I want to ask this question. In terms of your modeling and work that you've done, how big is the potential cost saving on deferment or limitation? Because, I was talking to another a friend of mine who was saying that actually by using some intelligent technologies, we can save up to, or not have to spend up to 15% of what our current expenditure is.
Yeah, and I think 15% is very conservative. Again, one of the reasons I say that is because they're talking about deferrals where they know there's a problem. Okay, we're talking about with distributed intelligence, with situational, what we call situational awareness, they can actually prevent having to build out any further. So it's a capital expense that they can defer, not just simply an operating expense. And like I said, in some cases they can eliminate it. So I think 15% is a very, very conservative estimate. And again, I think there's, when we start talking about it from a countrywide perspective, I think we're talking billions of dollars.
And in terms of all of that, I mean, that is so seismic. I mean, it's a big number. I mean, 15% is a big number, but you're saying that, hang on a minute, I reckon it's bigger than that, and and some of the pilot work you're doing is going to give you the real hard data to, put those numbers in and paint the picture about what happens. Why do you think then are we or certainly the utilities I talk to, we're spending so much time in talking about distributed intelligence and edge intelligence and even AI, it's rather than actually getting on with it? Because I would imagine with those sort of numbers, wouldn't you just do it? Is it the nature of the industry? Is it that conservatism, or do you feel like they don't quite understand fully yet the potential?
I think it's a combination. Again, I would have to say that most of it is that every utility is in a different space. So if you're in California or back east, you're already doing this. Utilities in both of those states are already they have either pilots underway or they're doing something with distributed intelligence. But we're also seeing that utilities that are in the Midwest, are beginning to take a hard look at this. So I think there are pilots underway. There is activity underway. We will start to see results across the board in the next couple of years. And I think at that point in time, then there will be quite a bit of activity in this space.
Because the utility sector is always looking for hard validation, right?
Yes.
So when those pilots are gone. Final question, I promise. How do we then tackle one of those other issues where, you've got utilities who are in regulatory environments where actually their asset base defines their value, and what we're saying is that, hang on a minute, you might be able to lower your asset base or defer it and things like that. What do we say to those folk? Do we need to do some accounting voodoo and magic to be able to
Absolutely.
make it an asset?
I think they're all looking for a new business model. There has to be some jujitsu involved in how do they grow their revenue? How can they compete in this new space? The transactive grid means that utilities are going to be looking at, can I get paid for people just entering in, using what is available, what I'm putting in, poles and wires? Can I provide other services besides just electricity? I think all of those things are being looked at very, very hard right now.
Perfect. On that note, we will leave it because my signals are getting ever more frantic. Thank you ever so much, George, for joining us in the studio. Thank you as well for watching. Thanks for tuning in.